Doodlebud here. Today we're going to be talking all about oblique nibs. Quite a bit of material we're going to cover. First, we're going to tell you, well, what is an oblique nib? If I can focus and show you one. That's an oblique nib. We'll tell you, what is it all about? What do they do? Why would you use one? Who is it for? We're going to compare a whole bunch. I got the macro lens out, so we're going to look at them all underneath the macro lens to compare, because they are all ground a little bit differently. And at the end, I'll give you some recommendations that if you are thinking about getting an oblique nib, I'll tell you where I would start. So to tell you what is an oblique nib, first I'm going to show you what is not an oblique nib. This is not an oblique nib. This is a medium off a Waterman. It's got a round ball at the end, and whichever angle you write with, you're going to get the same looking line. Writes wonderfully, so that is not an oblique. This one back here is very close to an oblique. This is a stub. So this is cut off at the very front of the nib here. Well, I shouldn't say cut, it's ground. Do not use nail clippers or anything like that on here. So we have a flat edge at the front, and this changes the line variation. So you're going to have a thicker downstroke. Let's set up the focus. There we go. A thicker downstroke followed by a thinner cross-stroke, and that will give your writing a nice line variation. This is an oblique. Let's get you in a little bit closer. So an oblique is essentially a stub that has been cut at an angle, ground at an angle. So instead of being flat here, it's cut back at about a 15-degree angle. It can vary, and it's going to have essentially the same features and line variation as a stub, but at an angle. So let's explain to you why. Why do you need an angle? First, let me just do everyone and myself a quick favor and just cover that up until this stupid fingernail finally grows out and doesn't look so disgusting. Okay, back to the oblique. So to explain to you why you would need an oblique, let's first show you how to use a stub, because they're so similar. The stub requires you hold the pen at a certain angle to the page, and along with essentially the writing angle you choose with your hand as well to get the line variation. So you want the thicker downstrokes, the thinner cross strokes. That's great. Now, depending how you sit to the page with your pen, it might be sort of awkward. Your wrist is kind of cocking back at a bit of an angle to get that maximum line variation. You can turn your hand this way a little bit, and then you can pull down this way to get that line variation and write. But there are certain writing angles where the way your hand wants to sit, it would be ideal if you actually rotated the nib backwards. And now the problem with the stub, let's get you in even closer if we can. That's as good as I can get it. Is the entire nib is now not in contact with the page. The front edge is lifting off because I want to sit with this rotated. That's what's comfortable for me. So it's scratchy. It's not working quite right. So now enter finally the oblique. This is the vintage one, by the way. New pen, haven't done the review yet, so we'll have some footage on this. This is like a 1951 to 54 Pelikan 400 with an oblique double broad, and this thing writes wonderfully. And so you can see here, it's cut back at that angle. It's very much like a stub. I'm going to compare other grinds from Montblanc and other places as well, so we can compare the obliques. So it's very flat, but just has that slight angle. Let's show you how this writes now for the folks out there who like to rotate their pens. So now with that nib rotated back, you just have this absolutely lovely experience that you would get with a stub for regular folks, but now you can rotate it at an angle. And we'll just do some quick writing. Oh, missed it a little bit there. Here we go. And it's nice and smooth. You get line variation, great flow, and it just gives a lovely flair to your writing, much like a stub. Now, as you saw, I missed it there the first time. I don't normally rotate my pens. So for folks who, you just do that all the time as a reflex, an oblique nib will probably be amazing for you. For folks like me who don't rotate their pens, I have to consciously do that, and it does narrow down the sweet spot, the correct contact angle that this pen wants to be at. It wants to be sort of at a bit of an angle here, as you see, and then also the nib rotated back. If you try to do that exact same thing with the stub, it's not going to work. It's going to just scratch. Like, you can maybe get ink on the page, but it's just a terrible experience. So a little bit of training, and if you get used to the nib, you get really rewarded from having, like I showed here, just lovely line variation. You're getting a lot of contact pad on here, so it's going to be quite smooth and juicy because we got a fairly large line. And it's amazing when you write with these things. If you've never written with one, you should at least try one at some point. But it gives you everything that you just love about a fountain pen. So we covered what is an oblique nib, what do they do, who are they for, use cases. Now it's time to compare. So we have a bunch of different pens here from different manufacturers. We're going to get out the macro lens, see what they look like. And you're going to see the grinds are quite different from manufacturer to manufacturer, also different eras as well. We have a new edition. This was loaned to me in order to do this video. I returned some pens that were loaned to me the other week, and he pulled out this lovely pen. This is a Montblanc 146 with a modern oblique double broad nib. And so this writes very different from some vintage ones I have that are just like that. So yeah, let's start looking at these pens and get out the magnification and see what we can find. First up, we have an old vintage Esterbrook J series. This is, I think, somewhere in the early 40s. Lovely little pen. Reason I got this one was because of the nib. So they all have numbers on them, which is a neat thing and quite collectible. You can get all sorts of different nibs for these pens. By the way, the new modern Esterbrook Esty has an adapter, so you can take vintage nibs in that cool pen. This is the 9314-B, so this has an oblique broad nib. Let's get you closer. As you can see here, there's that angle cut back. Looks like it's around that 15-degree angle, something around there. Very flat from the side. You would say, well, that's just like a stub. So the only real difference is that angle that's cut back. It's going to be very sharp and crisp. You can see there's no tipping on this one. This is just flat. Maybe there's a little bit left over, but it's very sharp, acute angles on there. So we'll show you how this writes in just a moment. Let's get out the next pen. Moving up, but we're still in vintage. I just showed this. This is an early 1950s Pelikan 400, and this has a gold one, and this is an oblique double broad. So at the very bottom, you can see the OBB. Let's go up to the tip. We got lots of nib creep on this one. Very similar style for the grind. We do have tipping because it's a gold nib after all. A little bit of a backwards angle, as you can see there. It just sort of rakes back just a hair. And that could also just be from usage over time as well. But very similar to how the Esterbrook oblique broad nib is ground. Moving up a few more decades, we have a Montblanc 24. And this has an oblique broad nib as well. With this nib, we start to see a bit of a difference, especially on the top side of the nib to how that's ground with the tipping. There's much more tipping left over. Same with underneath, it's more significant. And the grind is a little different. The lighting in focus is tricky to get. But if you can see it, it has a bit of a sweep this way. So it has a bit of an angle to it, which provides obviously a different feedback and writing experience when you're on the page. And now for a modern day Montblanc oblique nib. First, let's appreciate just how lovely this nib looks, the two-tone. They do a very good job of making a pretty nib. The 4810 in the logo, I always love to see it. But here we are at the business end, and it's much more significant. So way more tipping up there. We have some very detailed angular grinds that were put onto the tipping on the top side. It's much more angular when you look at it this way as well. So it's quite interesting the amount of grinding and detail that goes into this one. And on the underneath, it's very round. And I'll talk about this when I go to write with it. It's a super smooth writing experience versus some of the other ones. We'll show you the difference in line variation, max and mins, and just talk about this as well. So let's get to the best part, which is putting these nibs to the page. Oh wait, I forgot there's one more. This pen. For reference, this is a Montblanc 149. This is the Kiwi Pens. I don't think you can get this anymore. Jumbo ACR. It's a gargantuan pen. It's all ebonite. And it's got, just a regular number 6 size nib. A little lackluster for the honkin' size of the pen. It has a double broad nib that I decided to grind to an oblique double broad. Let's see how I did. Okay, so I did this nib years ago, and I haven't used it in quite some time. A little bit of over polishing there on the top for whatever reason. Okay, but we got that same angle. It's a bit of a different angle. You can see maybe closer to 25 or yeah, something like that. I'd say 20 to 25 degrees versus like the 15. Actually, maybe even more than that. Ground fairly flat on the bottom. It's actually not terrible. I haven't written with this thing forever. This is much more similar to, I'd say, some of the older styles where it's just essentially a stub, fairly crisp and blocky, and then just that extra angle cut that's on there. Now you can see not as nice and refined and polished as the proper manufacturers, but this is, this is not too bad for my first homegrown effort, I guess. I'm going to do a writing sample, the same writing sample for all the pens, so we can compare. I'll include the stub just so we can have an extra data point there as well. And what I'll try to do is just do a bit of a blend of talking while I write, but then also focusing, speeding things up so this writing portion isn't crazy long. But I'll try my best to get you some nice nib shots of the writing going on. Oh man, I was just about to write Monteverde for the pen. This is a Montegrappa. That's a big no-no. The stub nib on this Montegrappa is nice and smooth. It does have a bit of a pencil-like feedback feel to it. It even makes some noise, a little bit of a squeaking to it. I enjoy it. Nice line variation. The thin strokes are quite thin, as you can see over here as well. Decent on the downstroke as well. So I quite like it. You got to get used to it. It's kind of crisp, so that you're maximizing line variation, and you can have a little bit of a sharper edge. So the sweet spot, it's a little bit tighter on this than a regular stub. I'm just going to be dipping the nib on this Esterbrook for the writing sample. I haven't written with this pen forever, and I'm going to have to put this back in rotation. It's quite nice. Again, getting the rotation just right for each pen. Off camera, before I wrote with it, I practiced a couple loops and letters. I had to rotate this one actually quite a bit more than some of the other obliques. So something like this. So it's actually at a fairly significant angle. Once you get the sweet spot, it's nice and smooth. You do have to sort of keep your handwriting at a consistent angle. That's also a bit of a side benefit to using an oblique nib. I find it does a better job at keeping my lettering at a consistent angle because you sort of have to keep the nib at a consistent angle. As you can see with the printing, we now have a bit of an angle in each stroke because you have to rotate the pen versus the regular stub. Next up, the vintage Pelikan 400 with the oblique double broad. Now, I didn't practice off camera first with this pen, just thought I'll just jump right into it. I should not have done that. You sort of have to calibrate your hand if you're going between nibs. This one writes different than the Esterbrook, the writing angle where I had to hold at the sweet spot, and it misfired a little bit because I was off, so I should have practiced off camera first. But writing experience is nice, very smooth, very soft, extremely wet. Still getting a nice line variation, having to keep that slant to your writing. This one is more audible. So as far as the feedback, it has that sort of pencil type of feel. Just you have that much surface area, so you're going to get that feel to it. But this one does give more of a squeak. I don't mind it. I actually think it's kind of neat for some people. They don't like that whatsoever. I kind of like that feature with nibs when they squeak and squeal a little bit. So this one has that feature. Next up is the Montblanc 24 Oblique Broad. If you remember with this one, this was the first pen that we saw when we were checking out nibs that had a little bit more tipping on it, and you can definitely feel that difference. It doesn't squeak at all. This one does not have that audible squeak type of sound. It has a nice sort of resistance to the friction. It's not overly smooth, where sometimes it can be tougher to control a pen if it's just super wet or just super smooth. This one is tuned quite nicely, nice to control. Again, takes a little bit to get used to each pen. I would write more than this. If you're going to pick one up, you got to write a little bit, I'd say for 30 seconds to really dial it in. And now this one, the modern Montblanc with the oblique double broad. This by far is the smoothest of all the nibs, and I screwed up the Z, and that's driving me absolutely nuts. Anyways, so you saw the profile on the grind, if you remember, had a lot more curvature to it, much more forgiving. The edges weren't as crisp. So this one is just a really fantastic writing experience. If you like to write larger and just have a very smooth nib that's really wet, this is giving that experience. It's sort of like with different cars, how suspensions are tuned. You can have two cars with fantastic suspensions. Some will do better in the corners, some are better at cruising. This is the highway cruiser, just super smooth, cushy ride, really nice. You still get great line variation, but it's nowhere near some of the other ones that are a little bit more crisp. So you can just see, let's go, you know what, let me get out, I'll do it side by side. That's the Montblanc, that is the vintage Pelikan, and then the vintage Esterbrook. So you can see the cross stroke is much thicker compared to the other two. The Esterbrook seems like it's the thinner, but the downstrokes are about the same because they are both double broad. I'd say a little bit more on the Pelikan, but that cross stroke is much thinner on the Pelikan versus the Montblanc. If you look at the lettering, it's tougher to have the loop still appear open. You have to write much, much larger, versus with these other ones, you can have just the slightest little opening in some of your letters because you have that crisp edge and that greater line variation. And now finally, we'll do this crazy pen. I actually tested it really quick. It was so bad, I actually had to smooth the nib a little bit. So now I'm happy with it. So we have some ink up over here because I went to talk about how the writing was and the camera fell over, lid was off, ink everywhere. Good news is this ink is very easy to clean. Just paper towel and Windex. There was ink all over the place on everything. This nice white desk cleans up really well. So, word to the wise on that one. How the pen writes is quite nice. Great line variation as well. Not as thick as the other double broad nibs for the cross strokes, but pretty good. I would say it's the scratchiest. It's also a steel nib, but the Esterbrook here does a better job. You get more line variation. Actually, well, fairly similar. Actually, I think they're fairly close, but it is a little bit smoother than my homegrown job here, but still fun to use. So what can we conclude from all of that? If you like stubs, you ought to try an oblique. If you rotate your pens, you should probably try an oblique. And if you hate stubs because you rotate your pen, you should probably try an oblique nib. I think you should have one at least once. Now, I'd love to hear in the comments there, if you have one, which one it is, which is your favorite, all that great stuff. But also, perhaps you've tried an oblique nib, just did not work for you. Talk about that as well, because it's not going to be for everyone, but you should at least try one at some point. They're tons of fun. Which is my favorite? This is super smooth. It is a lovely, lovely writing experience. So as far as having the smoothest writing experience where you just write and go, wow, that's great, this one would take the cake, the 146 with the oblique double broad. However, it's not my favorite to write with. I would say this Pelikan here, this oblique double broad. So same nib size, but the grind is very different. The reason I like it is the greater line variation. This is the smoothiest, kind of cushiest ride. This one's quite nice too. But I do like the tactile sort of feedback, the pencil-like feedback this has, the little squeaks that it does. It's extra character to add on top of the characters that it does there. Next up, I would say probably the J series. The cool thing, I got to get back into this again, is the pen I'm not absolutely in love with. It's a great little vintage pen, but just size-wise, it's not my favorite. But I need to bust out my MV adapter and put this into one of my Esterbrook Etsy. I can take this nib off of this pen, have their little adapter, put it in a modern day pen, one of the Esterbrook SD pens, and enjoy the nib. I think I would enjoy this nib more just in a different pen. So that's a really cool thing that they do as well. But there we go. It is just destroyed. That's so annoying. I was worried I was gonna have a typo, like a spelling mistake or something. Instead, I just dumped ink all over this one page. Now, if you want to get your hands on an oblique nib, how would you go about doing that? Well, let me show you how I started. I started with this pen. For about 40 bucks, I picked up this vintage Esterbrook J series. The thing that really did it for me was because it had this oblique broad nib. I thought, I gotta try that out. Sounds like fun. It is fun. Not super in love with the pen, you know, nothing wrong with it, but just not for me. But I can borrow the nib, put it into an Esty. That's one way you can do it. Another way is if you like your Lamy 2000, you can order a different nib for it. So you can purchase individual nibs for the Lamy 2000. And I think it starts at oblique medium. So you can go oblique medium, oblique broad, and also oblique double broad. A little bit harder to come across. Not every retailer has them. Sometimes you have to go to eBay just to buy the nibs. That is one way. You can get one ground. You can go reach out to a Nibmeister and they can grind a pen for you. Or you can just buy just a nib if you want just a Yovo nib. And they can do just that, and they can fit on a bunch of different pens. But let's pretend this SD is your absolute favorite pen. You'll love it. You can get it sent off and have that work done. I would recommend start with a broad nib. You could also do a medium, but I would say at least a broad nib. Ideally, if you can find a double broad, it's even better. The reason being is you're going to maximize sort of the benefit of getting a Nibmeister to work on it. There's more tipping material, which means more line variation. And yeah, it's just, it'd be quite a treat to have one of those done up as well. You can also stay in the sort of vintage range and just up the price a bit more and get a nicer pen like this vintage one. This costs a lot more than this J series, but you know, depending on your budget, you can splurge a bit more if you have that and find a really nice one, a nice condition, and just the pen you want. And so there you go. Or you can spend a bit more and pick up a more high-end pen. More expensive pen manufacturers have that, so the higher end modern Pelikans, you can get that as well. Pretty penny for that on a Montblanc. They're gonna want a good dollar in exchange for a pen like this, but if that's in your budget, you can pick that up as well. And if you don't have much of a budget, you can make one yourself. You can take a pen that you have. I have a video on how I did this. Again, I wouldn't say it's like the holy grail in what you do. That was my very first attempt at doing an oblique pen, but I'll leave a link down below for the video, but you can watch how I did it and try it yourself and give it a go and have a fun pen and learn something along the way. And you can potentially just get the exact angle you want. Maybe it turns out 20 degrees is the perfect angle to cut on the end of that nib to grind that in. So you can personalize it that way. That would be the most cost-effective way, but I know that's not for everybody. That's for very few people. Well, we covered a lot of territory. I hope that helped folks out with oblique nibs, understanding them, seeing the differences between them, use cases, and how to get started if you want to get one. What you could do if you enjoyed this video is hit subscribe and the thumbs, drop a comment. Catch you next time.